Good evening, everyone. As Justin said, I'm Dale Cruse, and I'm the author of the HTML5 Multimedia Development Cookbook. I am a HTML5 developer here in town, and I'm really glad all of you could make it to this very first meeting of the Boston Tech Meetup. Very good-looking crowd, so I'm very excited to have all of you here tonight. There seems to be a lot of confusion about what HTML5 is or is not, how to use it, when to use it, and so on. So tonight, I'm going to explode some myths. We're going to discuss just what HTML5 is, what it isn't, why you should care, how to use it. We're then going to end with a few additional resources of some things you can do after tonight, and then have a question and answer period. And I should mention that during the question and answer period, I do have 2 copies of my book for the people who ask the best questions. So be thinking of those. And without further ado, how I learned to stop worrying and love HTML5. Let's take a look at what HTML5 is. HTML5 is, at its vital essence, the latest iteration of HTML. HTML5 represents evolution rather than revolution. It's old and new at the same time, which means we have backwards compatibility as well. The vast majority of HTML4 and XHTML elements are still perfectly valid. These as well. If you've ever coded any HTML in your life, these should all look very familiar to you. In fact, really, there's only a few tags that we've completely eliminated. HTML5 doesn't stop there. We've introduced lots of new elements, semantic naming, new inline elements, lots of new form attributes, audio, video, canvas, and more. And to be clear, there's a few things that HTML5 is not. HTML5 is not CSS3. Don't get me wrong, I love CSS3. In fact, I plan to never create a clickable button out of a background image using the sliding doors technique ever again. But though CSS3 is a complementary technology, it is not actually HTML5 itself. HTML5 is not a design aesthetic either. Remember a few years ago we heard requests for things called Web 2.0 design? What did that even mean? Same thing with HTML5 design. That's not a thing. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. And this might be the most controversial slide of the night. Which brings me to the first myth. HTML5 as a Flash killer. That's bullshit. HTML5 was never intended to be a competitor to Flash. It's a completely separate technology. Many of the things we used to rely on Flash to do, we are now capable of doing using HTML5, CSS3, and related technologies. There's really room for both HTML5 and Flash to coexist peacefully. But unfortunately, if you read anything about HTML5 in the news media, it all seems to be HTML5 versus Flash. And I hope that tonight I can help to, at least in part, undo some of that damage that the media continues to do to all of us who are interested in HTML5, as well as the Flash community itself. That was cheesy, wasn't it? The second myth, HTML5 is just a whole lot of hype. And there is a whole lot of hype surrounding it. But in my opinion, much of it is well-deserved. HTML5 is the latest iteration of HTML, the lingua franca of the internet. There are other technologies that have come and gone, but every page on the internet contains at least some HTML. In fact, even websites that are entirely Flash-based, the way that Flash movie got in your browser was through a little bit of the embed code in HTML. So, love those transitions. The third myth is that HTML5 is just not ready yet. And the people who talk about this talk about browser support, or lack thereof. And it's really not fair to say that HTML5 is not ready, because when we say that, we're looking at HTML5 as one thing. And in reality, HTML5 is made up of multiple modules that include semantic naming, microdata, web app APIs, and more. Some of this stuff is ready to use right now and is being used right now. All the examples that I wrote about in my book are real-life examples of people who are using HTML5 right now. And hopefully by the end of this, we're going to talk to you and show you some ways you could be using HTML5 right now as well. Fourth myth is about easy multimedia. One day, we're going to reach a point that the video tag and the audio tag that are new to HTML5 will become as ubiquitous as the image tag. Anybody who's coded HTML at this point, throwing up an image is commonplace. You don't even think about it anymore, because it shows up in every browser, and it's easy to code. It's not a problem. And if we're going to get there with HTML5, we're going to get there with audio and video as well. We're going to dig into this a little bit more further on as well. And the last myth I want to talk about is HTML5 as an XML killer. I heard this one recently, and I thought that was an odd take. XML is alive and kicking. It's doing just fine. HTML5 is not out to get it. They work just fine together. You can also use the XML syntax like we used in XHTML, where we closed all of our tags, quoted all of our attributes, and so on. And if you want to do that using HTML5, you certainly can. Just now you don't have to if you don't want to. Sharing is caring. So we're going to take a look at why you should care about HTML5. We can do more now natively in the browser without plugins than we ever have been able to do before. We're going to dig into this a little further. But first we're going to take a look at some advantages for just about everybody in the room. Who here is a web publisher? Who publishes websites? There's got to be a few hands. Come on. Good. Great. Great. HTML5 offers the ability to create mobile experiences like never before. You can develop one code base for your desktop and mobile experiences and use a variety of techniques to make those apply, like I said, on all your platforms. You can update your sites using technology that you already know. If you're in this room, you've dabbled in at least some HTML at some point. And as we looked at, the vast majority of those HTML and XHTML tags we all know are still perfectly valid. One interesting aspect that we were looking at, in fact, I was talking before the presentation with someone about this, offline access. There's a JavaScript API that's part of HTML5 that allows users to interact with your information even when they may not be directly connected to the internet. Who here is a web designer by hands? All right, good, good. To me, HTML5 represents freedom from for designers. Designers are no longer forced to use things like Flash for certain types of interactive experiences. We are capable of working more natively in the browser and using HTML and CSS and JavaScript to create many of those interactive experiences. But I have to think that there are still good reasons to use Flash. But it seems like the folks at Hoffler Frere Jones felt differently.
We've got to make restaurant website. Horrible. Horrible.
You're in the running for a book already. The comment was about HTML, about restaurant websites that are based in Flash often being horrible, and I think you're exactly right. I don't know why that's become a meme, a discussion all of a sudden, a punching bag. I'll tell you that I'm very proud to have created a restaurant website for a restaurant here in Boston, and we thought about as much about what we didn't want that website to be as we thought about what we did want it to be. And of course, the number one thing we didn't want was all sorts of things that distracted you from what you were there for. So it's really HTML5, it's CSS3, it's just a little bit of unobtrusive JavaScript, and it works beautifully on mobile. So I think you're oh, please. But if I can do this for a restaurant, you can do this for a restaurant. And so can you, and you, and you. I think there's an opportunity out there. I know I'm kind of getting sidetracked, but I'm going to take this opportunity. I think if there's a segment of websites that we keep hearing about that are subpar, there's an opportunity for contractors and freelancers who do know what they're doing to move in and take those gigs. Let's go get them. Who's a front-end developer like me? Yeah. My tribe, my people. There's a lot of new fun stuff for us in HTML5. The first advantage, starting with a simplified doc type. That's it. No more XHTML HTML 4.01, no more transitional, no more frame set, no more strict, no more. Actually, you don't even see a version number in there. So, this is technically not an HTML5 doc type. This is technically the smallest doc type possible to create an HTML document. So even one day when there's, if there might be an HTML6 or however many numbers, that's all you need. There's no version in there. How about naming things in code what they actually are? Let's take a look at a few examples. This is a modification of the slide we saw earlier. I once worked with a developer who used nonsensical naming in his IDs and classes throughout his code. And he would do things like div ID equals banana when it had nothing to do with bananas. And for him, in his mind, he thought this was some sort of job security. He thought that if he was the only one who knew what that meant, nobody else could figure it out, they could never get rid of him. And I guess there is some perverse sort of logic there. But that idea came to bite him, when he was editing something that he had created years before and couldn't remember exactly what he was thinking. And so he wasn't able to figure it out. It was a total pain. So, of course, the lesson that we learned from Jeremy Keith, never piss your future self off. So HTML5 allows us, when we name things what they actually are, then if we name something a header or a nav for a navigation element, then there's much better odds that when we look at that later, or another developer looks at that later, people can go, oh, I know what that is. There's no more div ID equals banana. In the future, audio and video elements will become as native as the image element. That looks good, right? Simple. That too. Someone waiting outside. So one day, the video and audio tags will become as ubiquitous as the image tag, which frankly is something we've kind of been waiting for since the earliest days of the web. It's kind of remarkable that it's lasted this long without it. Excuse me? No. The question was, has the codex for those been settled? And the short answer is no. The longer answer is it's confusing. And the longer answer I'm not going to bore you with right now. But we're going to look at that more in depth soon and talk about the fact that it's not settled yet and what we can do about it. Who here is a middle tier developer? Yeah. All right. I saw one hand go like this. Well, we front-end developers don't get to have all of the fun. In fact, the new JavaScript APIs may be the most significant and largest new addition to HTML5. So these things will hopefully keep you middle-tier developers busy for quite a while. Things like WebSockets offer a huge step forward in scalability. Who here creates web content? I think every hand should go up. One of the things that we're looking at in the future is HTML5 holds the potential of increased search engine optimization through semantic naming. What that means is those new tags that we briefly looked at, things like header and section and article and so on. Search engines in the future will be able to just search through an article for content, or just in navigation, or any of these new items. This is still a little ways away, but we can all see it on the horizon. Content first. For front-end developers, this alone might be the most significant change. For years, we created generic code, div ID equals something, P tag, the paragraph tag, and so on. And the goal was to be able to put any type of content in there, and we didn't care what it was. The goal was to create something as generic as possible and let the people who write content deal with it. We're all done with that. Now, we need to actually know what the content is to wrap it in the most appropriate tags. We're going to use the nav tag for a block of navigation. We're not going to say div ID equals nav anymore. For articles, we're going to use the article tag, not some generic div. For asides, there's a new aside tag. And there's lots more like this. So now when we're actually building a site, there's no more lorem ipsum. We're done with that as well. Content finally becomes a first-class player for us, and now we can develop around it. Because as our friend Jeffrey Zeldman said, if you don't know what you're designing, you can't design it. And finally, the most important group of people that HTML5 benefits are the consumers. Me, you, and everybody else. One of the really interesting things about consumers with HTML5 is there's virtually no upgrade path. There's nothing you have to buy. Probably don't have to upgrade anything. Probably. But even if you do, that's free. So it all happens behind the scenes. Our smartphones become even smarter using HTML5. And next, we're going to take a closer look at who's using HTML5 and how. World's largest search engine, Google, is leading from the front. The Google Chrome team created an experimental website with the band Arcade Fire. This is thewildernessdowntown.com. It's an extremely interactive music video. It features HTML5, CSS3, geolocation, Google Maps mashup, and even more. Facebook's always innovating too. They've used HTML5 mostly on the middle tier. Here's how. The HTML5 JavaScript History API enables selective loading of page content using AJAX, but still keeping readable URLs. And this is actually a video of a presentation that they had internally at Facebook back in the end of January of this year, where they were discussing exactly what we're discussing tonight. How do we wield this right now? What can we do with this? So some of these things we've already started seeing roll out, things like the History API, and of course the apps that are built using HTML5 as well. And of course, Apple. They've bet the farm using HTML5 and open standards for the iPad and the iPhone. And I think that if the world's most valuable company can stake its online presence on HTML5, why can't yours? And the real question you're probably all wondering, how do we start using this thing? That's what we're going to take a look at next. Here's a step-by-step process. First, update your doc type. Remember this? This is going to go on the top of every page of your website or web app. And when that's in place, congratulations, you're using HTML5. Now, you could just switch your doc type and stop there, and frankly, nobody would blame you. But if you're here tonight in this room, I think you're all ready for a little bit more than that. So you don't settle for the easy stuff. Let's take the effort to a new level. Semantic naming. This would be the next logical conversion. And we look at things like the new header tag. Excuse me, the new header element. I'm trying to eliminate the word tag from my speech. This often contains headlines for a page or a section of content. Footer, the opposite. This usually contains author information, copyright info, that type of thing. And also, like the header element, there can be more than one per page. Let's say you have multiple articles. Each article can have its own header and its own footer. Yes?
How does a browser that's fairly old interpret this?
The question is, how does a browser that's fairly old interpret this? It's a great question. Modern browsers, which we would look at, let's say IE 910, Firefox, Safari, and Chrome, they wouldn't skip a beat. No problem. We start to have problems when we have to deal with things like IE6 and IE7. It's unfortunate that we are still dealing with those. But there are a number of ways to deal with this. One of them, a guy named Remy Sharp, created the HTML5 shim, also known as the HTML5 shiv, which sounds much more violent. But the idea there is he actually uses some JavaScript to create these elements in the DOM, in the document object model, and set them to block, display block. And because old versions of browsers like IE6 and 7, naturally, when they look at a tag like this and they don't know what it is, they think, oh, display inline, which means like right next to each other. And these elements are set to should be to blocks. So Remy's solution takes care of that. That's, I think, one of the more common ways. My understanding is the latest version of the Modernizer tool, for those of you who are familiar with Modernizer, does what I just said and more. So they actually have incorporated this concept into Modernizer. And as we can, as we're moving forward, you know, browser, the amount of people using IE6 and 7 is not going to continue to grow. It's going to continue to decrease. So what we're looking at in HTML5 is really the potential of what we can do, some of which we can do now, some of which we'll be able to do shortly. The new nav element I mentioned is for major navigation blocks. Seems pretty simple. Now, the div. You may find it surprising I included this here. It's not a new tag, but we've used and abused it, haven't we? It used to be we just div ID equals this, and div ID equals that, and div ID equals banana, and we went nuts, and we all had divitis. And the div is still a perfectly valid, reasonable element using HTML5. It's just, I would say that its role is greatly diminished. There are better tags, better elements for each of us to use depending on our content. But if you need to surround something with a block level element just to style it, and it doesn't fit any of the semantic tags that we've already talked about, the div is still perfectly valid to use. So I want to make sure that the lonely div doesn't get shoved to the corner. I noticed a lot of folks, as they start learning HTML5, want to use every possible new tag for every possible instance. And I appreciate that, but sometimes it's just not appropriate. Sometimes a div is still just fine to use. Yes? If there, like I said, if there's a chunk of content that you need to be able to style that doesn't seem to match any of these new elements, notice I didn't say tags, then a div could still be in play. I noticed that a lot of the semantic naming that we're looking at in HTML5 is geared toward content-heavy websites. Publishing, reading words, viewing videos, looking at images. What about those of us in the e-commerce world? There are product display pages that we create that aren't really articles. They're not asides. You might make an argument for the section element, but even then we're splitting a hair. And I think that in the previous slide we saw the div tag. I think the div is still absolutely appropriate and in play. Yes?
The semantic elements, are they really ineffective with a way to distinguish them as specifics? Is there a lot of other attributes for those elements that we have to think about, or you know, is really sort of, well, this is a header, so that's really all you need to say? Assuming you're going to put a class or an ID.
Mm-hmm. I think there's multiple ways to answer your question. I think that we're still perfectly capable of adding classes and IDs to any of the new semantic tags in HTML5. But are these new semantic tags really just renamed divs? I guess if you want to think of it that way. But I guess you could also say, well, maybe they're all just renamed spans, or maybe they're all just renamed something else. I personally don't think of it as just a renamed div. I think of it because I think that takes away from it. It detracts from it. I want to think of HTML5 as something bright, shiny, and new. And I like to think that these new elements should be thought of as their own unique things.
I think the way to think about it is, in this article element, it's not a literal article, right, in the magazine. So the relationship of a piece of content to each other on the page. It's, it's not like it can only be content from a book or from a magazine. It is the relationship to the content to each other and that kind of document.
I think you're exactly right. And we're really re-looking at what our content is and what is the most appropriate way to mark it up. But if you're going to transition your current site or app to HTML5, probably the next thing you're going to start looking at is forms. Forms aren't terribly sexy, but I can tell you that in HTML5 they become way more interesting. And I'll give you a quick look at just a couple of the new changes. Back in the day, if we wanted placeholder text in a search field, you see value equals search, well that would show up as the placeholder. And now we actually have an attribute called placeholder. Hey, let's call it what it is. Now I can look at that and I go, oh, I know exactly what that means. I know what that's for. Value equals search. What does that mean? I don't know. I've been doing this for years. I don't know. I don't care. That makes sense to me. You ever create a date picker? I can hear by the laughter a lot of you have. Try to use an HTML and CSS to create a date picker, like if you're going to do, let's say, a travel website or something, you got to book an itinerary. What a pain. You end up having to resort to some sort of JavaScript framework to make it work. And even then, it was kind of kludgy. Now, look at that. We can now create month-based pickers, week, day, time. It's kind of remarkable to see a browser. Not every browser supports this, of course, but it's kind of remarkable to see a browser that does, and you just click it, and boom, there it is. What we spent years. That's why I don't have any hair. I kept making these date pickers.
Can you style date pickers?
Well, good question. The question was, can you style a date picker? The last that I played with it, date pickers really worked well in Opera. And then there were all the other browsers. So my understanding is, the last time I played with it was there's some limited styling that you can apply now. I think that this is one of those things that's going to kind of be fleshed out as we move toward the finalization of the HTML5 specification. Things like styling date pickers, things like accessibility for Canvas. These are all things that are missing right now, and we still need to sort out. There are plenty of other new form elements as well. It would take quite a bit of time to go through every single one of them, but this has really gotten a whole new look in HTML5. So when you're comfortable, after you've converted your doc type, semantically named your elements, and relooked your forms, you're probably ready to take it to yet another level. You're feeling confident, you're feeling good, you're ready for more, and that's what this next section is going to be. There's some additional resources here to keep you going. In terms of books, on one end of the spectrum, Jeremy Keith's HTML5 for web designers It's a terrific HTML5 book to start with. I would consider that the least you need to know about HTML5. And on the other end of the spectrum is the HTML5 specification itself. And if you're an insomniac, this is the cure. Because it's very technical, it's very dry, it's very abstract, it's very important, but it'll put you to sleep. You probably consider this the most you need to know about HTML5. And I thought there had to be a middle ground. My HTML5 Multimedia Development Cookbook is really a how-to. It's practical, real-world examples of how HTML5 is being used by many of our peers right now. In terms of websites, Mark Pilgrim's Dive into HTML5.org is probably the best free online source to learn about this new technology. It's really kind of remarkable how much information Mark is just giving away for free. I need to actually read my note for this part of the slide. Rich Clark, Bruce Lawson, Jack Osborne, Mike Robinson, Remy Sharp, Tom Ledbetter, and Ollie Studholm are the HTML5 doctors. This site is fascinating. It contains some kind of philosophical discussions of how we use these new tags, when it's appropriate, elements, and how do I need to start putting $1 in a jar every time I say tag instead of element. They have some terrific discussions on the site, and I really recommend it. HTML5rocks.com is not named for my friend Roxanne, but instead is been developed by the Google team. It's a little different than the Chrome experiment we saw earlier with Arcade Fire. That was much more experimental. This is much more practical. Contains some great tutorials and things to learn. And anybody who knows me knows that no event gets me as excited every year as an event apart. Jeffrey Zeldman, Eric Meyer, the rest of the crew travel to usually 6 to 8 different cities in America every year and talk about web content creation, information architecture, web design, development, and so forth. It's a really great event. And I love supporting local guys as well. The Build Guild meets once a month for beers up in Salem. And I encourage you to check those guys out. Mustaches are optional. They're mandatory now. Okay. I'm screwed. The HTML5 game development meetup is having a get-together on September 21st. You can check them out. That URL is kind of long, but you definitely check that out as well. There's a lot going on in the game development world in HTML5. Knox, did you get that? All right. What questions do we still have? Rob Champa.
So, having been on standards forums and the political games that are played, oftentimes what's most interesting is what's not on the truck. What was left out? What's HTML6 look like?
The question was, what's not in the HTML5 specification? What haven't we gotten to yet? What could be in HTML6 if there should be such a thing? So I'm going to answer that in reverse order. As of right now, there is no HTML6. That said, not everything's in the HTML5 specification. Some glaring omissions. Audio and video tags. The question was brought up earlier, have we settled on a codec? Nope. Different browsers like different file formats. Different browsers insist on different orders when you specify backup files for the video and audio files. We're completely missing accessibility for the canvas element. Lots of things that we still need to sort out. What can we include in the future? Personally, micro formats are quite mature. I'd love to see them folded into HTML5, or the future versions of HTML, I should say. I think we're ready.
What do you mean by micro? We got micro data.
We do have micro data and micro formats are two. My understanding is they're two. Micro formats include a way to further define content. Things like HCard, HReview, and so on.
Microdata replaces that in HTML5. Like you said, there was schemas already defined, person, events, all that kind of stuff. So you don't have to, because the microformats you have to use what they would call plain old HTML, right? And class definition in order to make something show up as a card or event or a person. That's all done in microdata, so it's all there.
Great.
Google knows about it, it indexes it, it shows up on the rich snippets and all that.
Great. Then you've provided even more info than I knew about that. That's terrific. Yes?
Sort of related to that question, what's your take on the HTML5 as proposed by W3C versus HTML5 as proposed by 1WG?
The question is my take on the HTML5 specification as put forth by the World Wide Web Consortium as opposed to the WhatWG, which is the Web Hypertext Applications Technology Working Group, I believe. And the WhatWG is a splinter group. They weren't satisfied with the pace at which the World Wide Web Consortium was progressing with the HTML5 spec. My understanding is the W3C took the approach of test then validate, what is it? Oh, I just lost it. Test then approve. And the WhatWG took the opposite approach, which was approve then test. And you could say one's a little more cavalier than the other, sure, but it's really caused the entire movement to move a little faster. One real difference between the two is the W3C is still using the term HTML5. They're still including that version, whereas the WhatWG has actually eliminated the number, and they're viewing HTML as what they're calling a living standard. So this is a fascinating concept. I'm not sure how it's going to play out, because there's no other software manufacturer that I know of that does that. It just, we'll just drop version numbers. It doesn't matter. Well, how do you know when something new's come out? I don't. Do you read the what's new releases? Well, Google. You're right. Google Chrome. You're not exposed to the version number, but that doesn't mean there isn't one. If you do about Chrome, there's a number, and I think right now it's 14 something something. So there is still a number attached to it. Google has created a scenario where you don't care. That's fundamentally different, though, than
meaningless to the developers as well.
If you know more about that than I do, can you talk a little about that, John?
Well, they're making it hard for you to sniff the user agent. So instead, you're forced to test for features in HTML5, for instance, or then the next version of JavaScript. For instance. Sorry, that's a different topic altogether.
Okay. Well.
But yeah, you sniff for the features in the browser instead of checking a version.
Good.
And that kind of fits with the living specification. HTML is not versioned anymore.
Right. Thank you. We'll see how this plays out. Yes.
When I think of Flash, I think of a matrix in which I have frames representing time going across the columns, and my layers representing, I guess, the canvas going down the rows. And then I can place information and control. Can you explain how HTML5 provides something equivalent in functionality?
The short answer is no. Because we shouldn't set the expectation in our mind of Flash and HTML5 being equivalent. They're not. They're two different things. They should be treated as two different things. One is not a replacement for the other. So if what you're looking for can only be accomplished using Flash, it would be folly to spend time looking in the HTML5 world when it isn't there. So I would caution you against that thinking of one being equivalent to the other. Fair?
So can you talk a little bit about animations in the HTML5, how one achieves them?
I think that using JavaScript, well, it depends on the type of animation we're talking about. There's some animation using the canvas element that we can use already. We can create some animation using CSS3 with things like transforms and rotates. And we can create additional animation using JavaScript. So it really kind of depends upon the amount of animation we're looking for. I think Flash still really excels at some things it does, like animation. And I think that if Flash is the tool to use it. Yes?
I was going to also say CSS3 will be pretty useful for the animations aspect of things.
Absolutely.
And I think I see Flash as still a good carrier of video so far, although it can be bloated. But I was going to ask how HTML5 is best used for mobile sites, and how is it different from your regular computer?
One of the big discussions going on in HTML5 worlds these days is it's talking specifically about the iPhone. HTML5 versus HTML5 applications versus what we call Objective-C applications. The Objective-C are what some people, it's a programming language, and some people refer to those as native apps. And those native apps can access and control parts of the hardware of the iPhone itself that HTML5-based apps cannot. A lot of people are getting around the iPhone App Store by creating HTML5-based experiences, which you then just give away. And so the problem there's pluses and minuses. The advantage is you don't have to deal with Apple's release cycle. When you submit an app to Apple, it can take time for it to be updated, to get published through. Then maybe you notice a tiny little bug that you're able to fix. You submit the fix, and now you wait 2 weeks before it gets approved while everybody is giving you 1 star in the rating system. HTML5 circumvents that completely. The downside of the HTML5-based mobile apps, you don't actually get money from them through the App Store. So you have to make decisions about what your app is doing, whether or not you think you can make money out of it, and then decide which of these routes you're going to go.
I'm also thinking about, say doing a site for a company, and they want 2 versions, mobile and their regular sites. So I'm making an assumption that the markup is a bit different, and probably the design is different. You have to think about doing different dimensions and what you want to actually, what's more important.
Sure. So the question, if I understand it, is the potential of making a website for both the desktop and mobile experience, and how we deal with that. You mentioned you imagine the markup would be different. It might be. I imagine that the CSS is going to be more different. But I think you stumbled onto something really important, and that is really thinking about what's most important to display. We don't need full desktop experiences on mobile phones. sometimes that's not advantageous at all. A lot of sites, you look at the site on mobile, and it's just the least amount you need to know. And I think it's really important to think about where you're publishing your content and how to be able to best leverage the devices you're publishing them on.
Isn't that where media queries come in, though? HTML5?
Well, sure, but that's just a method to serve up various types of style. So while the markup may change mobile to desktop, I'm saying I think the CSS will change even more. Yes?
One thing you want to make sure that with mobile is that you tailor to your user. So it's not just making your website smaller so that the bigger screens actually looking at it and taking an editorial view of mobile and saying what your users are trying to get at, like what are the most popular things. But also offering them the option to use your full mobile site. Mobile browsers have a lot of errors, back in 2007, browsers were really mobile sites. But we're still doing HTML, XHTML for mobile sites. But there is a difference between mobile sites and mobile apps, too. Mobile apps is where HTML5 is really going to play. Mobile sites are already running HTML. It's just a matter of changing the public dom type. But also, what we're doing is we're contact with the agent that is an agent too. So just make sure that you're keeping in mind your user and looking at what they're trying to get at.
You're Nicole, right?
Yes.
Nicole, it's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm glad that you finally that we've finally been able to meet. And thanks for coming out. I'm going to give you this.
Thanks a lot.
My pleasure.
I just want to ask something on the mobile.
Okay.
I'm not here for that. I actually run a iOS development group and stuff. So many apps in the App Store are just HTML5 apps inside the native browser, right? These are tools for Go, very easy to do, phone gap, and a whole slew of tools that will let you make. And there are many apps on the App Store now that are just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript apps. A lot of developers now are going mobile first, right? Because and the markup isn't that different. CSS isn't that different. There's a framework called Less Framework, which uses media queries, gives you 10 columns on desktop and 3 columns on mobile, and you don't have to do a whole lot to make that happen. Because they handle all the easy stuff. The jQuery mobile that renders UIs across a whole bunch of different kinds of phones. And you don't have to worry about dealing with that. So it's not like an esoteric thing anymore, like kind of like what you were saying. And a lot of people now want mobile first, and because that's taken out so much now. And even now in some categories, there's way more mobile traffic than there is desktop traffic. That's only going to increase to the
Yeah, it's just making sure too that you want to make sure that the user experience is seamless and that you go from your mobile device maybe to your desktop browser. That you want to make sure that it's consistent and make sure that you're really keeping the user in mind. And another thing too, HTML5 with the semantics or the markup that it's doing now is that you want to know who your content is, the content status. Right now, I think it's really exciting for us because we're combining all of these different disciplines, user experience, usability, front-end development, mobile development, into this one sort of like great, drive.
Yeah. I'm really so happy right now that we're sparking these kind of conversations. I'd really like to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Really appreciate it. If you have additional questions or if you'd like to chat with me afterwards, please do come see me. But I hope everyone had fun. Thank you so much. Good night.